Welcome, Katherine and Kerry. Thank you for coming today to the inquiry. I'm going to ask the Commissioner to do an acknowledgement of country for us, please.
Thank you. Acknowledging that we are holding this meeting on Kaurna country, pay my respect to Kaurna elders, our Kaurna elders past, present and emerging, but also really importantly to acknowledge our Aboriginal children and young people whose future we want to make better. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask you to affirm your evidence before we start, so my associate will guide you through that, please.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to repeat after me, if you could just speak into the microphone as well. So I'll start on the right. I solemnly affirm that the evidence I will give
I solemnly affirm that the evidence I will give
will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
And if you could please state your full name, your workplace address, and your role, please.
Katherine Sarah Hawkins. I'm with the Department of Human Services as the Executive Director of Inclusion and Reform.
Thank you. And after me, please. I solemnly affirm that the evidence I will give
I solemnly affirm that the evidence I will give
will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And if you could please state your full name, workplace address, and role. Thank you.
Kerry Beck. I'm the Director of Safer Family Services in DHS. Do you need my home address?
Workplace.
Workplace address. So Riverside Building, North Terrace.
Thank you.
Thank you. Katherine and Kerry, thank you for coming along today. As you're aware, this is the inquiry into the Aboriginal child placement principles being conducted by Commissioner Laurie. We've provided you with some questions that we hope that you'd be able to address, but we understand that you've prepared an opening statement and welcome you to start with that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I also acknowledge that today we're on Kaurna land and our ongoing and intentional desire to do things better and differently for the child and family support system, children and families here in South Australia. Thank you for letting me read an opening statement. I think it might just help frame what we've been working towards in the child and family support system over recent years. The vision for the DHS child and family support system is for children to be safe and well in their families, community and culture, and its family preservation programs work to support families to care safely for their children and reduce the need for their children to be placed in care. Child and family support system services sit between universal and tertiary services, although we acknowledge that in real life these things are not experienced as individual silos, but to explain how we've designed a system as a spectrum that spans from intensive family services, providing case management and therapeutic interventions for families with children at higher risk, through to services providing earlier support for families at lower risk. I'll come back to the service design in a moment. Aboriginal families are a priority group for CFIS. We know that the trauma that is collectively experienced by Aboriginal peoples due to the catastrophic impact of colonisation, racism and subsequent policies is passed down from generation to generation. Responding to intergenerational trauma must be central to CFIS if we want healing and change for future generations. CFIS services work within culturally safe, trauma-responsive frameworks. This is a deliberate, systemic approach across the service system. Family and culture are seen as sources of strength and protection. We have created with our sector partners a number of resource materials for practitioners and service providers to build capability in these areas and recognise this is not a one-off exercise. DHS has committed to the Aboriginal system design criteria developed during the CFIS co-design process to create a system where Aboriginal children are front and centre and it's family focused, which reflects Aboriginal cultural strengths, Aboriginal people's right to self-determination and the truth of our shared histories, the hurts, the strengths and the healing. Further, the Aboriginal co-design principles provide direction for everything that we do in CFIS. These principles give status to diverse voices, knowledge, experiences, skills and perspectives, and acknowledge intergenerational complex traumas, hope and strength. The Aboriginal co-design principles also establish how Aboriginal people will be supported by co-design allies, which commit allies to support self-determination by Aboriginal people in true partnership, to deeply listen, learn and seek guidance and direction on right protocol and ways of working, to commit to self-reflection, build cultural fitness and responsiveness, practice cultural humility and respect. Work with Aboriginal people to translate their vision into systemic design and challenge the barriers to this, including systemic racism and individual and organisational white privilege. In terms of the Child and Family Support System, or CFS specifically, the core elements of CFS include co-design of a 3-tiered system of family support that includes the commissioning of services from the NGO and ACO sectors. The co-design process, which I'll provide further evidence on later in this session, for the new CFS involved about 1,000 service users of diverse backgrounds, including cultural leaders. A data capture for a learning system for improved understanding of the complex needs of vulnerable children and families is central. Data also contributes to continued practice improvements and supports better decision making. And when I say data, I mean more than statistics, although they are important and powerful. But critically, the data also captured by lived experience and practitioner wisdom. Thirdly, reflective practice, where families are at the centre and play a strong role to guiding our practice and in designing our services and systems. CFS priorities and actions are set out in the roadmap for reforming the child and family support system, and the centrefold of the roadmap depicts how all areas are underpinned by a healing approach, which is core to the whole system's design. An approach that combines Aboriginal co-design principles, as I mentioned, as well as trauma-responsive system principles. DHS has a dual role in the direct delivery of family support services through Safer Family Services team headed by Kerry Beck, as well as a number of non-government organisations and ACOs. DHS is committed to and is providing 30% of all our external funding to ACO providers. This is part of the department's commitment to support Aboriginal self-determination and aligns with closing the gap priorities such as the growth of the ACO sector. There are 3 tiers of family preservation programs within CFS, and these have varying degrees of intensity. Tier 1, as you can see on that handout, are the out-of-home care prevention programs and
Sorry,
intergenerational
Katherine, can I just
impact.
interrupt there? Just for the transcript, I just want to say that you've tendered a document that's headed Child and Family Support System, CFSS overview, that sets out what the tiers are, and that's what you're referring to in your evidence.
Yes, thank you. Tier 1, out-of-home care prevention programs and intergenerational impact focus, which focuses on families at imminent risk of having their children placed in care and populations with elevated risk of entering the tertiary child protection system. Tier 2, intensive family services, provide a very high level of case management, therapeutic intervention and practical support to assist families to improve family functioning where there are high-level safety concerns. Services are evidence-informed and required to work within culturally safe and trauma-responsive frameworks. The 3rd tier, Strong Families, Strong Communities program, assists families with medium to lower level risk concerns, including families who may benefit from step-down services from intensive services, and does include a self-referral pathway. At present, all Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3 external service contracts, as I mentioned, 30% of that funding is going to ACO providers across those 3 tiers. We're also committed to the requirements under the National Agreement towards ongoing financial reprioritisation and reallocation to ACOs in partnership over coming years with SACON. We are also aware that we've only just begun this journey together as a sector. CFS is still quite new, having technically been implemented only a few years ago. We have strengthened the cohesiveness and consistency of the child and family support sector, especially in the ways of trauma responsiveness, cultural competence and accountability, but there is more to do. Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the organisation, which is what most of our questions are directed about, I'll just start, we'll work through those questions that were provided to you, if that's all right with you. In the conduct of the hearings, we've received feedback from the Department of Human Services staff during the workshops that there are significant benefits of having Aboriginal practitioners working within the sector. However, the feedback indicates there are not enough Aboriginal practitioners or staff, including and particularly in leadership roles within the sector. What are the barriers to increasing employment of Aboriginal practitioners, and what measures would you propose to remedy those barriers?
Thank you. We do, as a department, DHS has an Aboriginal workforce strategy which has been in place for a few years and comes to an end this year. Our intention is to do a new one next year, and we will engage in consultation, especially with our own workforce, about ways in which we can attract, retain skilled workers across all levels. In terms of the that broader piece and community services in general, we know that there are chronic workforce shortages across all areas, and it's an incredibly tight labour market, incredibly competitive, and that is absolutely the case as well for Aboriginal workforce, with a huge amount of competition to attract talent in every part of the business. We understand that some of the barriers, apart from that one, just in terms of the sheer competitiveness and workforce shortages, can also be that working in this sector in particular, of the sort of broader child protection and family support sector, is not attractive to everybody. It does take a particular type of passion and interest, and also to dispel some myths perhaps about what the sector is doing. So we have worked very hard over the last couple of years to also promote who we are and what we stand for to attract people to work for our organisation. Some of the other barriers in the past have been dealt with things such as the Office of the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment exemption to enable Aboriginal people with cultural expertise to enter the AHP stream of classification without formal qualifications, and also expansion of employment pathways, including AHP1 level positions. But we also recognise that part of attracting Aboriginal people, and any other person, to work for an organisation is that there are clear career pathways as well for people to progress in their career. And so we have also recently secured funding for a range of cultural leadership positions as well, in particular in Safer Family Services, so that there is that career progression pathway.
So has that exemption been obtained?
Yes. Yep, that's been in place since 2017, I believe. And so, yeah, in Safer Family Services, we employ Aboriginal staff across the board without formal qualifications, but with cultural expertise to provide both case management and cultural consultative positions.
How many practitioners have you got working within that sphere?
I might have to take that on notice, but it is a considerable amount. We have about 30 Aboriginal staff across Safer Family Services. Some of them do have formal qualifications though, so I'd have to get an exact number that are affected by the exemption.
With the contracts with the NGOs in the commissioning aspect of the work, is that an expectation of those ACOs or NGOs that they too can have the exemption with the way in which they attract, Aboriginal employees?
I think that exemption specifically applies for public sector classifications at the AHP level. Different non-government organisations and ACOs do recruit to different types of positions. So for some of them, they will have positions that are specific to those that require formal qualifications. However, I also know that they're employing a number of people across the child and family support system that don't have formal qualifications but have other, as such, cultural expertise or other skills.
The reason I asked that question, I'm seeking from you whether your contracts stipulate a particular qualification required of those funded positions.
I don't believe so.
Don't believe so. Thank you.
So the next question we have is that from your non-Aboriginal staff, what cultural competency training do they receive within the organisation? And how is that delivered? Is it a workshop, training days, community engagement, or is it simply that they're expected to self-educate and read specific documents to fulfil the requirement for cultural competency?
Again, there's different layers. So we do have the DHS, Aboriginal Cultural Footprint Training Framework, and so that applies to all employees within the Department of Human Services. So if we're just sort of with that one there, which was developed by Tilly Coulthard when she was our Aboriginal Workforce Consultant, and that has 4 steps in the training framework in recognition that, again, this is not just a once-off exercise. So step 1, which is mandatory for all DHS employees, is an online training module called Aboriginal Cultural Awareness Training. Step 2, which is a requirement for all frontline staff who are working directly with Aboriginal communities, and also many in policy and strategy roles where their work has an impact on Aboriginal communities. It's called an impact program, and that goes more into the history of colonisation, systemic racism and the experience of Aboriginal people here in South Australia. The third step is a cultural appreciation workshop, which is actually internally facilitated by DHS Aboriginal staff, and goes more into the strength and protective and cultural protocols that exist from that. The one that I did from that individual's perspective and sharing their family experience. Step 4 has yet to be formally developed, but that's probably a focus next year for the new DHS Aboriginal Workforce Strategy. And conceptually, step 4 is about an individual person within their particular role and where they're at in their professional life, taking some greater accountability for what that next piece of cultural learning needs to be. So that might look different for different people in different roles. In terms of the child and family support system, and that includes Safer Family Services staff as well as all our NGOs and ACOs, we fund a number of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to deliver Yaitja Minka Minka Puratapinthi, Indigenous trauma healing training, which is a requirement and is embedded in our contracts with all our non-government organisations that they are required to complete that at 100%. So that all intensive family service providers are required to do that training with those ACOs. That is a face-to-face training program which aims to stimulate self-development and self-reflection around culture and trauma, and a personal cultural development plan is developed for each individual person as part of the workshop, which includes ongoing areas of learning for them. Safer Family Services leaders are also required to do Tracy Westerman training, cultural competency for supervisors of Aboriginal people. And we're very excited that just recently we have developed an e-learning module on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle, which is also now part of Safer Family Services induction. So that's rolling out across Safer Family Services staff and will also be available to all our NGOs and ACOs.
As in the 5 elements of the
Yes.
Yep.
wider policy.
To the standard of active efforts,
Yes.
and what does that look like? In terms of other things that support competency and things on an ongoing basis, as I mentioned before, we're also recruiting, our intention is to recruit a number of cultural leadership positions across Safer Family Services, and those roles will have a core role in each of the regions across the state in also providing cultural advice and cultural knowledge for all our staff in Safer Family Services.
And who has determined what the requirements for those leadership roles will be?
Well, we haven't rolled them out and recruited to them yet, but we have been taking advice from our Aboriginal staff about what the functions of those roles should look like. Did you
We
wanna-
have appointed an AHP5 manager of Aboriginal Service Development who's leading a project around implementing cultural governance across all of our services. So she's just recently recruited a Aboriginal cultural consultant for every region, and they start in the next few weeks. And then the next phase of that will be to get Aboriginal cultural practice leads for every region as well.
Is that person that you've appointed, is she Aboriginal?
Yes, she's Aboriginal, and she's appointed to that AHP5 position under the exemption.
Right.
How many regions do you have?
As of January 1, we'll go live with our 4th.
So what are they?
The regions?
Regions.
They are outer north, inner north, central and south.
I noticed no country.
Oh, they've all got country regions
So
attached to
metro
them.
with a country
Yeah.
outlook. Yep.
So the far west is attached to central, the Limestone Coast and Mount Barker,
Southern.
Murray is southern,
Yep.
and then out the mid-north is attached to the outer north region.
Yep.
Riverland to inner north. So they've all
So
got...
sorry, how many of the Aboriginal cultural consultants have you appointed?
We've got one who's already working, and as of last week we have offered the other 3 and they've been accepted.
Right.
So what does central, just to clarify for me, what does
Central-
central cover?
Central goes right across the middle, so from Burnside, sort of inner northeastern areas, right across to your western metropolitan, and then over to the far west coast to Lincoln, Ceduna.
Yep. You just wanted to navigate
Yeah.
what that direction was for central. So central was
Right across the
hooking
middle.
across to the west.
Yeah.
And including APY lands?
We don't have a footprint on the APY lands, but we are developing a child and family support network up there. But we don't have funded services.
So are there any?
There's no funded intensive family services on the APY lands, no.
Okay.
Is there a particular reason why there is no delivery of services or funded services for intensive family support services across the remote areas of the state's far northwest?
I don't have a specific reason. I guess as the system was developing, that was a service that was delivered through mainly education and child protection coming together on the lands. Having said that, it is extremely difficult, obviously, to recruit to people on the lands, and so and fly in, fly out is not optimal. But we are trying to think about how we could get a footprint up there, and the Child and Family Safety Network is the first step of that, I guess, to engage partners to see what is being delivered and what are the gaps and what gaps do we need to fill around this space.
So is that work being done?
Yeah, the CFSN on the APY goes live in February.
Right.
Yeah. So we're doing that right now.
Good. Thank you.
And it's also going to cover Cooper PD.
So at this stage, there's nothing Cooper PD either.
We do offer some services to Cooper PD through Safer Family Services, yeah, but there hasn't been a child and family safety network up there.
Right.
And that'll be from the central region.
It's based out of Whyalla and Port Augusta,
Yeah.
yeah.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the service provision to Aboriginal families, and I think you've addressed this in your opening statement, but I'll just ask you to reiterate it. The services you're providing, are they based on Western models of service and intervention, or are they specifically Aboriginal systems?
So, as I said in my opening statement, the first step that we undertook in building the new child and family support system was that extensive co-design approach, which took many months and engaged over 1,000 people, including people with lived experience of the system and those with cultural authority and leadership who were all part of co-designing what the system should look like. And this diagram that's in our the centrefold of the roadmap really articulates the outcome of that, which was that a healing approach that recognises trauma, especially for those with intergenerational trauma experiences, has to be core and central to what we do. So in the design of the new family support system, that model was central and was informed by that approach. As I also mentioned, the central part of it was also the Aboriginal system design criteria and the co-design principles, so that at every step of the design and ongoing evaluation and testing of the system that we would be applying those same models.
So how often is it revised and reviewed?
The child and family support system. Well, as I said before, it's still quite new. So our current contracts with our NGOs and Aboriginal community-controlled organisations are all due to, at this point, end in June 2025. And so we've got a lead up that we'll be starting now, really, with our providers who are a couple of years in to start asking how are we going, what are we doing, what might be next in the future. But we haven't designed a tender approach or a commissioning approach that will follow that yet.
Right.
As far as the co-design goes, the strategy document ends in 2023. So we're now just starting to engage in a process around how we'll go out with another co-design to redesign the next 3 to 5 years of the system.
Right. Is that problematic, having things funded for short periods of time and having to revisit them?
I think when a system is new, there is some benefit to not having a place so far in the future before you ask yourself the question about whether what you're doing is working or not. But I think, you know, we will need to engage in that consultation process over the next couple of years about whether the shape and function that we've got in place is working for people.
Right.
So we're 2.5 years in now to intensive family service contracts, and are starting to get some of those insights about the things that are working well and the things that we're learning through our data capture that we've set up to actually be able to measure, you know, how many families and what sort of services they're getting and what the outcomes are. If I can just also backtrack to your question before about Aboriginal models of practice. The intensive family support system, for example, which is that middle tier, are fundamentally based on child safety and wellbeing, but also within the context of the range of things that we know sit around what helps families be strong, and we're very interested in measuring family strength and protective factors across a whole range of domains. I can provide you with a copy of that tool. But also we have a number of programs, for example, our Aboriginal community-controlled organisations are providing, such as Taikatina Tirapinthi, which is delivered by KWI, Aboriginal Corporation, and that was co-designed by KWI with community over 4 months and is a program specifically for families at imminent risk of children being removed, but really focuses much more on cultural strength and healing and trauma. And so they were obviously much more fundamental in the design of that service.
So in this model that you've given us, where is their focus? Tier 3, 2 or 1?
Taikatina Tirapinthi is in Tier 1, but KWI provides services across all 3 tiers.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
So when did they commence implementing the Tier 1 initiative that you've funded them for?
That started approximately 2 years ago. I'd have to check my notes on the exact date, but it's been about 2 years.
Do you have any data on the effectiveness of the program in preventing, through services to those families, entry into out-of-home care?
My understanding is that they have seen over 30 families in the time that they have been in operations. I can give you more information about exactly how many families they've worked with in the western suburbs. And the final evaluation report hasn't been completed yet, but the indications from the evaluations that we've done to date suggest that over 90% of the families who commenced that program are still preserved at the end of their case management time with Taikatina Tirapinthi, which is a great result.
Okay. Are we able to get that data?
Yes. Yeah.
Timeframes?
Well, if there's other questions that come out of today, we can package something
Okay.
up for you fairly quickly.
Yep.
We've got all that to hand, so it shouldn't take more than a week or two.
Thank you.
Which question are we up to?
We're still on
Sorry.
3.
Yeah. You want to talk about the practice
Yeah.
framework?
Do you want me to do that? I guess the other thing we have done across Safer Family Services is we engaged Aboriginal consultants Dana Shen and Shirley Young to lead a consultation co-design development process across all Safer Family Services staff to develop a Aboriginal cultural practice framework for Safer Family Services. That has now been, it was launched in February 2023 and its implementation is active across all Safer Family Services programs. It's also being embedded through reflective practice elements and sessions with all staff across all regions as well.
We may have provided a copy previously with a submission, but if we haven't, we can provide another copy, part of our evidence.
Yeah, yes.
I think you've got one.
Early on in the piece,
Yep.
yes.
Thank you.
I've got a question in relation to the child and family support system. You said earlier, Part, that it's Tier 3 in which there are self-referrals.
Mm-hmm. That's new.
That's new. I heard directly from a whole range of Aboriginal families about how services don't encourage their self-referral when they have insight to issues and accessing services in their time of need. I would like to hear from you as to the potential or the issues as to why self-referrals aren't part of Tier 1 or Tier 2.
It's probably useful to explain the system as it was and then the system as we've initially started to design it in the last couple of years. So when the Department of Human Services was asked to build a new child and family support system, the question was, who are the most vulnerable families and, what are the most evidence-based services? The Early Intervention Research Directorate conducted quite a rigorous piece of analysis to use epidemiological data and evidence to identify what the numbers might be of families and children who might need intensive family services or family support services. The system before then was quite incoherent. It wasn't clear how many families there were that were needing these types of services. There was unclear referral pathways. If you managed to find one, you were probably quite lucky, but they certainly weren't very strong and coherent in terms of navigating into the system. And there wasn't really any clear indication as to whether the services that were being provided were working and were giving families and children the services that they need to help produce those positive outcomes for them. So off the back of that co-design approach that we talked about was to implement the foundations of a system that would first go to who are the most vulnerable children and where are they and what do they need. And so intensive family services commenced at that time with the Pathways team. And it was very quickly apparent that there are many, many families that need that. The ERD data suggested that there were approximately 8,500 families with 12,500 children who needed that level of support. So Pathways service was established as a means of helping to provide a triage service so that the families that needed it the most would get the first service availability as that new system came online. As you say, there's the current referral pathway through Pathways services for departments for child protection, birthing hospitals in health and education, with some small numbers of referrals coming from the Multi-Agency Protection Service, MAPS. The self-referral pathway in strong families, strong communities, however, has been enabled through the Adults Supporting Kids website. All of those services are going to come onto that website, and that'll be the place where we hope families will be able to self-navigate to services. So that's quite new. The Adults Supporting Kids website was set up also now, I think, a couple of years ago, and provides families with a non-stigmatising information location where they can also do some self-reflection questions to find out what it is that they might be help seeking. They can, ask the website itself questions about what they need, and that website was co-designed with our lived experience network system advisors to try and present a website that was as non-stigmatising as possible, so that families felt safe to use it. And there is a geospatially enabled map in the website, so you can actually enter in, Blair Athol, and it will come up with the services that exist for you in that region to try and make those self-referral, self-navigation pathways stronger.
Do you think that they're culturally appropriate for Aboriginal families and their children,
The website,
and ways in which you can actually get help to navigate through the myriad of services?
it's one mechanism, it can't be the only one. And as I said, it was designed with the advice of our lived experience network system advisors, and there are Aboriginal people from South Australia on that system advisory group. So we took their advice in terms of the ways of designing the website and the service navigation mechanism in that website to make it as user-friendly as possible. It can't be the only way that we support families into the system, though. So I think, we need to continue to look for other ways to help families self-navigate, including through community support and obviously people being able to access services in their local area through trusted providers.
How do people find out about that?
The Adults Supporting Kids website. We do have quite a lot of promotional materials, so we've got posters and cards and pens and things, and so we do promote it through a lot of different places, including universal service, public health services, Aboriginal community controlled health organisations, really
Children's centres and schools.
anywhere we can.
Yep.
Thank you.
Can I just hone in a little bit on the self-referral for intensive family services? What we've learnt since the Pathway Service has been in place, and we talk about this in some of the other evidence, but I just want to make it really clear, is that of the referrals we get into Pathways now per year, we have the ability in the intensive family service system to respond to about 40% of them. And that's related to level of resources and capability within that service system. So
And that's
I guess,
tier 2, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess it's what that's shown us is that it's really important that we triage all of those referrals coming in to make sure the most in need 40% get the services we've got to offer. So, our hope and dream is that we will expand capability and capacity in that system, and as we do, we will open up referrals. But right now, we process about, and these aren't exact numbers, but we process about 4,000 referrals a year, and we can give about 1,900 services a year. There really isn't much point us opening it up any further and just processing more referrals with no outcome possible for people. And what we wanted to make sure was that the people who really need it the most get it. And that's the rationale behind closing it up, collecting the data, making sure we know who the people are that really need it, get it. And then as hopefully we are successful in gaining more resources for that system, we will open that up. And hopefully one day anyone will be able to refer through Pathways and we'd have enough services.
I guess then with the service at KWI as tier 1, are there any other Aboriginal community controlled entities that are funded to do
Tier 1?
Tier 1?
No, there aren't. There's only 100 service outcomes in Tier 1 across the whole state, though. It's very small. There's only 3 programs in there. And they are directly referred from DCP. They have to have an open case.
That was
with
my next
DCP.
question. Yeah.
So they don't come through pathways.
Yeah, so you'd have to understand I guess, where I'm looking at in terms of the whole application of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Placement Principle in its 5 elements, prevention, and the amount of our Aboriginal families that come to the attention of child protection, where many of those actually sit in Tier 1. And looking at the resource allocation from a state level position, there is very little going into that space. What do you say to that?
Well, you're absolutely right. There are the need at all 3 tiers far outweighs the current service system capacity.
Thank you.
And what immediately could be done to address that?
Well, I think other than the magic bullet of more investment, noting that the workforce capacity to meet investment gets to your first point, your first question today. So it is a challenge that needs to be considered in many parts. But I really do believe that the more that we can help families ask for help earlier and work together as a sector to destigmatise asking for help, and that parenting is hard, and if it's not going well and you're worried, that it's okay to ask for help and to access service support at those earlier places, including from the universal service system. It doesn't all have to be targeted family support services.
Very true. And in terms of what we know are generally those organisations or community services in which families touch base with varying levels. I'm not sure whether it's a question that you can respond to, but it's about what we traditionally know as the good old-fashioned neighbourhood development. So it isn't really like the formal self-referrals, but it's more about where families can go to actually just get help and just get information and navigate because they've actually got a relationship with an organisation, and whether your organisation has resources that actually support those organisations to reach out and make themselves available to rebuild that sense of neighbourhood for members of our Aboriginal community who are most vulnerable.
I think it's a work in progress, is what I'd say. From the department's perspective, we have community centres across the state, and there is an intention for there to be an Aboriginal community centre, and for that to be an area of growth, which we can provide you more information with. I don't have on hand with me today, but we recognise, to your point,
that'd be good.
Yeah, to your point, April, those community-based strength, neighbourhood place-based approaches are some of the most effective things that we can do, especially in that earlier help and prevention element. Tirrapindi Wadley is another initiative that you may be aware of, which the department funds, which exists in the West, which is also, again, much more of a place-based initiative to support people living in the, I think it's down in the Port Adelaide Enfield region, is my
That's the
recollection.
Dead Moyle.
That's right.
Yep.
So there's some of the examples. And of course, Commonwealth also funds a whole range of programs and initiatives in the sort of broader family and community space as well, which sit outside of the evidence we're providing with you today, but that's all part of the broader sector.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've already looked at question 4 about your practitioners having access to culturally appropriate assessment tools. I mean, you're clear on that when you're opening program.
I think there's probably one thing that I would add to that we haven't covered off on, which I think is important. Again, when we first set out with the co-design of the Child and Family Support System, the Early Intervention Research Directorate did do quite a lot of research to determine whether there were any relevant tools in the family support system at that time that were culturally informed, and they were not able to find one. So with advice from the Safer Family Services Aboriginal Practice Lead and many of our Aboriginal staff, we developed our own tool called the Family Snapshot. And that same tool is being used now not just across Safer Family Services but also by all our non-government organisations and ACOs. And we are intending to test the validity of that and to gain advice as well from all the practitioners using that. So it's not validated yet, but it was a new tool. The Family Snapshot.
What's the aim of it?
Oh, sorry, what's the aim of it? The aim of it is to get a measure at baseline, so when you start a service with a family, and then again at case closure, to see whether there have been any significant changes across a range of presenting experiences that that family is having in their life that might be impacting on their ability to parent their child safely and family wellbeing. And each of the items are on a rating from stressor to strength. So we're really interested in what are the sorts of things that might be causing stress to the family at the outset that we can help create strength through our practice.
That's for all families, or one that's been developed by Aboriginal workers with the Aboriginal community for Aboriginal families and their children?
That tool specifically is being used across the whole system, but we also have funded Aboriginal Family Support Services in a partnership with Flinders to do a validation on their tool, and that is underway. That hasn't been completed yet, that piece of research, but that's also an initiative that we funded.
Thank you. Thank you. How many programs do you fund for early intervention services?
So across those three tiers, we have 24 non-government organisations and ACOs providing 36 programs.
And what are they, and where are they across the state?
Well, to Kerry's evidence before, we have got intensive family services all across the state with the exception of APY lands. Safer Family Services are statewide. Aboriginal Family Support Services are also statewide. Most of our other funded programs are regional, so in particular regions. AFS and Safer Families are the only ones that are statewide. But in the combination of all our providers, we cover the state with the exception of APY currently.
Right. And how is it possible for a service provider to apply to you for funding, or do you appoint the service providers?
We don't accept generally unsolicited proposals for funding because of the funding allocation is currently fully utilised. Doesn't stop people approaching us and saying, I've got a great program, let's have a chat. But generally the funding envelope is fully utilised at present. And the way in which those non-government organisations and ACOs have come online has been iterative over time. So when we implemented intensive family services, that was a single commissioning process that saw all of those providers come on at once. Just in July, all our Strong Families, Strong Communities providers at that lower level tier 3 all have just come online. And the tier 1 programs started at different times in the first couple of years of the child and family support system, like Tikatina, Terapinthe, which I mentioned before.
Sorry, I'm going to ask it. And how is the assessment done about their effectiveness? In terms, is their funding contract contingent on KPIs or some level of effectiveness? How does it work?
We do have KPIs that are in all the contracts with our non-government organisations and ACOs, including, as I mentioned before, 100% of practitioners are required to do the Indigenous trauma healing training with the ACOs. We're also measuring their capacity, like how many referrals they accept, and we're also measuring changes or number and percentage of families who have child safety and wellbeing indices increase over time. In terms of the, will that or won't that affect the tender process at the end of 2025? That hasn't been determined and designed yet. and our intention is to do that collaboratively with our system over the next couple of years about that. We also have engaged Better Start to do the system-wide evaluation, and that is due to happen next year, and that will inform the commissioning process as well.
Okay, thank you. I think is the question 6, the funding allocated for early intervention, what proportion is allocated? I think you said earlier it was 30%.
Yeah, 30% of our external funding is with ACOs or ACOs in consortium.
And this one's actually about Aboriginal families, and 30% of all of the funding is prioritised for Aboriginal families.
Right.
How much?
30%.
30%.
So given the statistics that we know in terms of the disproportionate representation of Aboriginal children in the child protection system, how is 30% landed on?
Well, 30% is the level of representation that was in the ERD data around the 8,500 families and the 12,500 children that make up what we call the CACYP population. So ERD did a piece of research around which families were most at risk of going deep into the child protection system, and of those families, 30% of those were Aboriginal. So that's where we landed on. That was how we wanted to support Aboriginal families coming into the system pre-removal.
Right.
Like, I understand that particular approach that ERD provided. How long has that percentage been in place? Because when you look at the figures of the disproportionality in the out-of-home care results, one would expect that the level of investment would be commensurate with what is actually transpiring in outcomes of removal rates across the level of vulnerability in our Aboriginal communities. So what is the potential for the review of that percentage and actually the systematic approach to how you make the carve-up of the funding available?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely part of the negotiations with SACON and schedule for child protection under the South Australian Implementation Plan. Like we're committed to do that financial reprioritisation as required under the national agreement, and I think part of the decision around the investment strategy into ACOs over time, we'll have to look at those numbers again in terms of what is the appropriate proportion.
I think too we need to look at the numbers of referrals coming into the child and family support system, not just those who are in care, because I'm not a statistician, April, as you know, but there's obviously a difference in how those proportions end up, because what we know coming through pathways, referrals for Aboriginal families sits loosely at around 27 to 29%. So we're only getting that many families into the system. So obviously when, as a proportion of kids in care, it's larger, but as a proportion of this...
So what you're saying is
system over here...
The driver is actually the referrer.
Maybe, yeah. And I think we need to look at that. But at the moment, we're not getting more than 30% Aboriginal families into the CACYP system to allocate that money to.
You're not getting 30%?
We're getting
It's about
just
28.
under, yeah, about 28%.
28% of our referrals, Aboriginal families.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. So the next question is again a funding one. How much of the funding is committed to the ACOs for the early intervention and prevention services?
That's the 30%.
That's the 30%.
Yep, that's right.
And how is that structured? Do the organisations have to re-tender for funding on an ongoing basis, or how, once they're part of the system, are they ongoing without having to be reassessed on a regular basis?
So this probably gets back to the point I made before about the fact that at the moment the contracts are due to end in June 2025. So the process between now and then, and with the Better Start data and in the consultation with our providers, will be what happens on the other side of that. That hasn't been determined yet.
Right. Okay. So how did the ACCOs that are involved in this early intervention work, how were they recruited? How were they determined who was the appropriate organisation to take that on?
Kerry, who was here before I started in this system, may be able to answer the question in terms of if specifically, because I think I know the answer, but you might know it more clearly. But in terms of the recent process for Strong Families, Strong Communities, that was an open tender process. So ACCOs who were interested in being part of that family support Tier 3 program offering could put in a tender, and we had a number of tenders from ACCOs, so we've got a number of ACCOs now in that tier.
How many do you know?
Well, there's 4 individual ACCOs, but in different representations. So some of them are in consortiums with other, for example, non-government organisations, or they tendered by themselves, or variations. So we've got a bit of a range. Yeah.
Thank you.
Did you want to talk to IFS? Because I think it was a closed process.
Yeah, the initial IFS tender process was a closed process with agencies that were already delivering services in the family support arena. And at that time, AFS and KWY were the providers. And so we did a closed process with those providers. But I guess the interesting and good thing about that process was we engaged all of those providers pre the tender process, and it was those providers that agreed to increase and quarantine the 30% funding for ACCOs as a group. Which we were really pleased with at the time. So that money was increased to 30%, and we did the closed process negotiation between AFS and KWY, and we did a closed tender to all of the others with the 70%.
Right.
So I'm just trying to get in my mind. So this is like the Section 20 under the Act in terms of
Refer
C
to
funds.
state authority.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to get to understand how this model operates.
Which one are you pointing to? IFS?
The whole child and family support system. Or if there's a component, which I think you might be alluding to.
IFS is mainly where the RSAs go to, yes.
So, and the 2 Aboriginal services are statewide services,
AFS is statewide.
KWY is not.
is metro based.
It's in the western suburbs of Adelaide.
Yeah.
So how is a intensive family support service delivered on a statewide basis
Well,
to families in need?
AFS do have statewide capability, so everywhere that KWY is not, AFS are. So we do have statewide ACCO coverage, but all other services also deliver 30% of their services to Aboriginal families.
Thank you.
Would it be helpful for us to talk a little bit about what happened with CFARNs specifically?
I think that will really be helpful.
Thank you. The change.
Yeah, so I will throw to Kerry, who also knows this detail better than I do, but at a high level, when CFARNs was originally established, it was conceptualised to have multiple design elements. It was going to take referrals, it was going to provide case management services, and it was also going to provide a network, multi-agency network. What we quickly realised in the operation of CFARNs was that it became very quickly overwhelmed with the volume of families requiring case management. And so because of the setting up of the new system and also the desire to have greater visibility, as we talked before, through pathways of being able to count and account and ensure that the most vulnerable families received a service, CFARNs, as it was effectively split into 3 separate service components. So what we now have is that the referral part that was the original CFARNs is now pathways. The case management part, which is the intensive family service part, is a program called Safe Start, which is provided by Safer Family Services and also a contract with RASA. And then the third part, which was multi-agency networks, is what is now referred to as the Child and Family Support Networks. And we have those across the state, CFSNs.
Yeah.
So CFARN as a thing doesn't actually exist anymore. It's now Pathways, Safe Start and CFSNs, and we have those across the state to enable multi-agency meetings to come together. They do also do some referrals, So referrals sometimes also do come to that in that location, place-based approach to say, we've got this family, we're really worried about them, who can take them? And we've got our colleagues there from across government, like health, CAFs, education, child protection, but also NGOs and ACOs who are in those regions come to those meetings as well.
How often are those meetings conducted?
How often? Mostly they're fortnightly, except where we're trialling referral and allocation mechanisms through them, then they're twice a week.
Right.
So we're testing a few different things.
So do you have data on the effectiveness of the services? Because I'm thinking about the relationship to reunification for children with their families, but also the relationship to prevention, if that is indeed what intensive family support services is for.
I do have a piece of data I have here I can share about the effectiveness of intensive family services. Let's see if I can find it.
Particularly from our two Aboriginal funded agencies.
I don't think I've got that data here with me today, and we are still...
Can you provide that?
I will need to have a look at that. The reason I'm hesitating is because we haven't yet finalised the evaluation of the effectiveness of the intensive family services. That's one of the reasons we've brought Better Start on to do that main piece next year. But our early findings from our family snapshot data that I mentioned to you before, that all our providers across the state do at the beginning and then again at case closure, is indicating promising results for families who completed intensive family services. It shows that reported strengths in families doubled and the number of stressors reduced on average from 11 to 7, indicating the service is effective at supporting child safety and wellbeing for these families. We'll know more next year when Better Start do their full evaluation.
Yep.
Thank you.
The other thing that we are nearly at the point of being able to do is determine, obviously we know how many families are still, how many children, sorry, are still with families when we seek services. But the big piece of work that ERD is working on is to be able to then connect pieces of data across the state to determine how long post-intervention those kids have remained out of care. So we're almost at the point, at the 2-year point for the first cohort of CACYPs, because we're pretty new. We're nearly there to be able to determine what percentage of kids in the first cohort are still with families 2 years down the track. So that's probably the most exciting thing we're trying to get to. But that sort of longitudinal data takes time, and so we're nearly there, and fingers crossed it tells us that kids are still at home.
Thank you.
Up to
Number 8. The expectations of the Aboriginal-led services from the perspective of DHS and how that performance is measured. Are those expectations different from the expectations of non-Aboriginal-led services working within the child protection space? And if so, how?
The short answer is no, they're not different. What we have tried to achieve together as a whole system is consistency. Right. Consistency of quality and consistency of practice, and that our hope and intention is that all the good things that ACOs are doing, all our NGOs should be doing too. And that, as I say, that strength of practice is across the whole. So I have a list here of the things that are in contracts, but it includes things like, as I said before, family preservation rates, which we'll be able to measure over time, the number and percentage of families with improved family safety, family functioning, access to community supports. We also require they do an initial safety plan within 4 weeks of service commencement, because obviously child safety is fundamental to the work. And a key one, as I mentioned before, is that 100% completion of the DHS endorsed cultural competence and trauma responsive training that's delivered by our ACOs.
So if there's no distinction in terms of your expectations of an ACO, what is it that sets them aside? why refer to an ACO? What's specifically Indigenous or Aboriginal about an ACO in terms of its service delivery to Aboriginal people?
I think that's probably a good question for
It's
the
in the-
ACOs themselves.
It's
but
in the
our
governance of the
governance,
organisation,
yeah.
really. So they're led by a majority Aboriginal board, and they're led by
Often
Aboriginal,
100% board.
and Aboriginal community. So it's in the governance of the organisation that's embedded. That's the key difference.
Right. And how does that filter down to a vulnerable family on
That
the
one I
ground?
can't answer. You'd have to ask an ACO. Sorry. Yeah.
And I think what we're trying to get at is, from the understanding of what you do in your contracts, is the emphasis is on how does an organisation like DHS in its contracts understand the value of an Aboriginal community controlled organisation. And there are various Aboriginal community controlled organisations that, we say some other Rolls Royce standards. It's more than just the governance, it's the Aboriginal leadership in the organisation, it's management, it's workforce. And when you have Aboriginal communities that are all diverse, different cultural groups, I'm wondering about a statewide service, how effective it is in actually, because it's not local level Aboriginal community controlled. It's one board for the whole state. It's one leadership for the whole state. So for me, that question being asked is about how does a government agency like DHS understand the value of local level Aboriginal community controlled support for our most vulnerable Aboriginal children and their families?
No, I think it's a really good point. It's not currently in our contracts and service agreements to measure that or hold organisations to some accountability about that.
Because I've heard from Aboriginal families and children themselves the value of a local level Aboriginal community controlled organisation assisting them in their time of need. And it's a message to an organisation like DHS. How do you build that into your operating procedures around developing your contracts and when you're wanting outcomes for our children and families, as much as what I'm seeking for?
We'll have to give that further thought.
Yes. So thank you for that question.
That's all right.
So, and I think you've very clearly, Katherine answered before that question number 9, do we consider sufficient funding and resources in the early intervention and prevention sector to meet the community need? I think the answer was very clearly no. So
If we had more,
you're
we
not
could do
able
more.
to deal with them. Yes. The barriers to successful early intervention and prevention measures. What do you see those as?
I think for me, like I said before, one of the most significant barriers is the stigmatisation of asking for help early, and our role collectively as a community and as a sector to work towards destigmatisation and creating non-stigmatising pathways for families to access early help and support, and that they can access those when they need them. One of the priorities in our roadmap is right support at the right time, in recognition that right support is an individual thing, it's a local thing, April, to your point, and it also has to be at the right time for the family. One of the biggest barriers is actually that because of a lot of families perhaps not feeling like they know how to get help or feel safe to ask for help, we see a lot of families in crisis, hence the numbers that we see at the point of the system where we would like the bulge to be somewhere else entirely.
Something we've heard from public forums is that Aboriginal people, particularly young Aboriginal women, pregnant women in particular, have a very strong sense that their Aboriginality is seen as a risk factor in itself. And so to admit that you need help is basically inviting the department into your life, which understandably historically was something they don't want. What would you say to that in terms of the services that you're offering?
Well, I think we heard really clearly in the co-design approach variations and versions of what you've described there. And again, that the design of a child and family support system that is not the statutory agency must come from the perspective of it being a healing approach where culture is a strength. So what I would say is that we have worked really hard everywhere we possibly can and have more to do, so that as families come into contact with our system, that actually they hear straight off the back, we're here to help you, culture is a strength, what do you need, who are your strong people in your life?
How can we help you connect?
Yeah.
And if there are problems that you recognise as being very significant, do you refer? Do your staff refer to the department?
Yes. We have an escalation process that we use if we feel that risk is too high for us to be able to mitigate, where we work with DCP around escalations. And also, obviously, as mandated notifiers, we are required to notify at any point that a new risk becomes known to a practitioner. So we do notify a lot. Often that gets referred straight back to us in the process. But
So is there any sense that you and the department work together? Or is it either or?
No, we do work together across that intersection of risk. The escalation process starts with practitioner to practitioner negotiation and then gets escalated up through the various levels and can go all the way up to ED or CE if needed. But it certainly starts regionally.
Just for the transcript, can I ask you what ED and CD are?
Oh, sorry, ED, Executive Director and CE, Chief Executive. So it can go all the way to the top if need be. But we have partnership meetings in every region between CFIS providers and DCP regional officers where we get together fortnightly, where we get together and talk about how we work together, but also particular families that we might need to work together.
Do families participate in those meetings? If you've got all these agencies talking about a family, I've heard from families that it is very rare that they're actually involved in discussions about themselves by agencies.
Yeah, they're not always, that's true.
Yeah.
But there are case conferences. We certainly involve families in case conferences. Families aren't involved in partnership meetings per se, where we meet every week. They're not always about individual families. They're about the way we work together, but also individual families are raised as a point of reference that we might need to get together around this family because we think there might be a problem.
Yep.
But yes, we certainly do want to have client voice in those conversations as much as we possibly can.
Yep.
One of the other things I would just say quickly about this question also pointed to the idea of being proactive rather than reactive. And one of the things, and Katherine has touched on it, but we know that in intensive family services, for example, 80% of our referrals come through DCP.
Right.
So any system that is reliant on a notification to get a referral for family support, in its very nature has to be reactive, can't be proactive, because we are waiting for notifications to go to DCP and get RSA back to us. And that's where we talk about an earlier entry, where people can get into the system directly to a pre-statutory service to get support, rather than have to come through the statutory system and back for the pre-statutory support. That's a critical element of service design, system design that we think we need to work towards.
And we've heard that from other organisations as well too, that the frustration that they're not being able to be self-referral and then engagement with services that might be able to keep them out of the
Or even
system.
referral from universal services earlier, rather than universal services having to notify.
That's right.
And then DCP RSAing back to us. People don't need to touch the statutory system necessarily. They need to come straight in
So
pre-statutory.
my question then is DHS able to make a referral to a family group conference?
No,
Not at this stage.
not at this stage. Certainly something we're advocating for though.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. think the Commissioner's just asked the question of the change of legislation placing more emphasis on early intervention and prevention. Would you consider that would provide better outcomes for families? So I think that's just it. I'm not sure how we can make the legislation do it, but it needs to be the system itself allowing for, as you've said, people not touching the statutory.
I think legislation forms a really important foundational element in system design, absolutely. We also know that legislation alone won't get you there in terms of good outcomes for families. It has to be the policy, the practice, the partnership, all those other elements that come together. So the answer is yes, and I think.
Because our legislation at the moment is really designed at removal.
Sorry, is that a question?
That's because we've taken out the best interests of the child out of our legislation. We've got the overarching safety, which then gives the mandate for removal.
So DHS really strongly advocates for a public health approach in the changes to the legislation, very strongly.
That's very good to hear. That'd be extraordinary change of attitude around. Thank you. We've heard evidence that there's an Aboriginal connection team which sits within DHS. Can you tell us about the composition of that team and their role, please?
Yeah, I'll hand over to Kerry to talk about the team structure in a bit more detail, but it's useful to understand why the team was created in the first place. When we first implemented the intensive family service stream, and as I said, the whole sector sort of went, oh wow, these families are actually a lot more complex than we ever thought they were, because the system tried to get those services to the families that needed them the most. We did have feedback at that time from our Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisation partners that the mechanism by which we do the referrals and that initial home visiting could be strengthened in those early couple of years of setting up the new system. And so we worked together with our ACCO partners to sort of co-design what an Aboriginal Connections team might look like, including in particular to help facilitate the sharing of information that ACCOs and NGOs don't have, that the department has access to on C3MS. So that was the impetus for implementing that team, to sort of help basically facilitate a stronger and smoother process. Did you want to talk about the team structure and what they do?
Yeah, sure. I guess the other thing that was a big push around this service were the ACCOs saying to us that the initial home visits to families who weren't aware of why they were coming were very difficult for Aboriginal organisations to undertake, and that there were issues for them around being viewed as welfare or a statutory response. So our role was to share information with them, but also work with the ACCOs around first visits and how and what's the best way to have that truth-telling conversation with that family in a culturally appropriate and respectful way. So the positions, there's 4 positions in the Aboriginal Connection team, 4 FTE. They're all AHP positions, they're all dedicated Aboriginal positions, and so they all also have access to the exemption that we have.
What level are they? Level 4?
Level 2 and 3. I think I've got here exactly what they are. There's a level 3 supervisor, there's a level 2 at the top, senior practitioner, and 2 level 2 ACT practitioners. So they work closely with the Aboriginal controlled organisations to support intentional and active engagement with the Aboriginal families. They receive the referrals from pathways, they do the assessments, they provide the information and the referral documents to the ACCO. They then work with the ACCO around how initial meetings will work with the family. Sometimes they're done jointly, sometimes we do them, have the conversation, engage the family, talk to the family about choice of provider, and then hand over to the ACO for delivery of the ongoing services.
Right. So at the initial engagement with the family, are they told what's brought
Yes.
them to the attention of the
Yep. Across all of the CFIS, it's really part of the service delivery is really clear and honest conversations at initial visit around why are we here, what are the concerns that we've been told that there are, and how are we going to move forward around the safety of the child and the wellbeing of the family. That's essentially the initial visit. Very difficult clinical conversations to have with families. They're very skillful practitioners. But yeah, that's the crux of the work.
Right. And if there's refusal to engage, does that result in a referral back to the department?
No, not at that point, not unless risk escalates to a point that we think that there's no chance of us being able to engage and mitigate. We operate via an assertive engagement model, so we will continue to try and engage different engagement methods with the family. So no, it doesn't result if there's a refusal.
So the Aboriginal Connections team is an internal IFS team.
It's internal to Safer Family Services.
But,
think
but which one does it work in? Across all three?
No, under IFS, yep. Just works for IFS.
But what Kerry was describing there in terms of the assertive engagement approach
That's
is across
everybody.
intensive
Yeah.
family services, not just for the ACT team. The ACT team were about us facilitating that process with our ACO partners, which they asked for us to establish and do together.
Yeah.
Whereas the assertive engagement approach, and to your question about what happens if families don't engage, that highly skilled approach is something that we do across all of our IFs and that we talk a lot about in our communities of practice with all our NGOs and ACOs about how do you engage with families and how do you have those initial honest and transparent conversations about why you're there and what you can offer.
So what is the standard practice then expected across with the team and with all the NGOs that are funded? What is that? What does that practice look like?
Well, we have an assertive engagement practice guide that Safer Families have developed, which we've shared with the NGOs and ACOs, but they are not required to use it. It is not mandatory. It's not in their contracts. From our perspective, we're all learning as a sector about what works and how to do this work better and differently. And as I said before, we've got a communities of practice approach. In fact, at 3 different levels. We do it at the practitioner level, and we do it at the leadership level, and we also have a chief executive community of practice. And all of those mechanisms are about us sharing what are we hearing works, what do families need. Right back at the beginning of the co-design, the people with lived experience who participated in the co-design of the system said, we want you to be honest with us when you rock up. Tell us what's at stake, tell us why you're there, and come with the perspective of a healing approach and a culturally informed trauma centred approach, but be honest with us about why you're there. So as Kerry says, they're really tough conversations, but it's all about building engagement about, what do I bring, how can I help, and sometimes that takes multiple times and efforts and different strategies. We've got some emerging data that is suggesting that some types of engagement strategies are more effective than others. So you won't be surprised to know that if I just send an email, I'm probably not going to get through the front door. But things like practical support, brokerage, food hampers, and multiple face-to-face efforts to build rapport and be seen as credible and purposeful is what is most likely to be effective at engaging families. We are engaging approximately 64% across the system of our Aboriginal families in particular. We know that those rates vary depending on what's happening for the family, but also how you do it.
Is there a time limit on your engagement with any given family?
There's no hard and fast time limit by which we pack up and go home. As Kerry said, for Safer Family Services, they will just keep trying until they're successful, or if risk escalates to the point where it's no longer appropriate and manageable. Different NGOs and ACOs deal with that differently.
Right.
If they feel that the engagement is unsuccessful, they may close, they may make a referral back to Child Protection or tell us that they were unsuccessful.
And is there a choice for the families about who they engage with? or what services they engage with, or do you determine that for them?
At the point of pathways, when we first receive the referrals and do the service matching, we do have an Aboriginal practitioner who's part of that team to apply a cultural lens to the matching of the
More than one. Yeah. Sorry.
more than one. Thank you. To do the service matching between the family and the service, so that cultural consideration is right up front at the beginning of the process. Families can ask to have a change of provider. That would be entirely dependent on whether there was capacity in their local region for someone else to pick it up.
And you're just going back a step. You're consultant who applies the cultural lens. In that, do they do that with the family? Is there a discussion with the family about whether there might be somebody involved in the organisation that they don't want to be involved in, or
Not at that
don't
point.
want
At the
people
point
to
of
know?
pathways, no.
Right.
No.
Does that happen at all?
Yeah, it does happen, and particularly with the Aboriginal controlled organisations, if there is a conflict at the point of referral, they will say to Pathways, "This can't happen,"
Right.
and we'll reallocate that to a different service.
Right.
Yeah, but Pathways doesn't have contact per se with families; they are purely a referral, assessment, allocation unit.
Yeah. I would imagine correct me if I'm wrong, but in regional areas it would be very difficult if there is a conflict with whatever service provider is there, because you'd have
Limited options.
limited choice, wouldn't you?
You can have limited choice. Most places we do have more than one provider. Some country regions, two is the limit, but most places we have more than one. A couple of the outlying places we don't. But those situations we utilise the Child and Family Safety Network, which is a network of other agencies in the region, to come together and work out, well, how could perhaps the IFS provider support another agency to deliver the service.
What other agencies would they be?
Well, around the table at the CFSNs, we have housing agencies, we have health agencies, we have mental health agencies, drug and alcohol services. So whatever providers are in the region servicing this population sit around the table for those meetings. And so if there was a conflict for the IFS provider, we would work out how another person or agency in the region could deliver services with support.
So that's answered our number 15 about families knowing and being given a choice, and 16 in terms of the time frame. And we've heard from DHS staff during the workshops that the availability and capacity of intervention services, such as the drug and alcohol support services and the mental health services, is not sufficient to meet the need, which results then in very lengthy waiting times for families, who often can be given limited timeframes to address the concerns by the department. Would you agree that limited access to services is in a timely manner disadvantages some families and places them at greater risk of the statutory intervention? For instance, we've heard that there can be a 5-month wait to get into drug and alcohol counselling for some areas.
Yeah, there's probably a few things I'd say about that. One is that it's not just drug and alcohol services where there may be an overwhelming need. Mental health, housing, drug, domestic and family violence services. We're experiencing that same pressure in terms of families experiencing multiple complex needs, and many of them are the same families. I think in your preliminary report, it was also clear from the data and evidence, we understand that many of the families who we're talking about are the same groups who are showing up in multiple service systems. So I think that pressure is experienced across a range of places, which is why it's just so critical for us to keep talking about how we bring service systems together. And I think the CFSN is one good way of thinking about different ways of doing that. But in terms of service responses, one of the other things that we do have available to us, which isn't to say that challenges with volume don't exist, but in terms of managing it, Safer Family Services and also our NGOs and ACOs all have access to brokerage funding. So if they can't find the support service, for example, on a public system, they can purchase services for families, and sometimes that can work to get services more quickly responding to families if you can purchase them through a private arrangement. Brokerage is critical in this system.
So in terms of your conclusion of engagement with the family, how do you assess that a family has managed and addressed their child protection concerns?
So that family snapshot tool that I mentioned to you before is one of the mechanisms that, as a system, we're capturing data about whether those changes have happened from case commencement to case closure. Most of our providers use their own tools. We didn't force a singular case management tool on all our providers. Many of them had been operating in this area for some time and have their own tools, so that'll look a little bit different depending on who you ask in terms of how they make those clinical decisions. Although there's consistency in practitioners in terms of what clinical assessment looks like and how you would determine that. Safer Family Services in particular utilise a child and family safety plan, which is a more detailed plan in terms of whether the family are taking the steps to address the care and safety of their children that have been identified as the areas to focus on. And a child safety risk rating tool is also utilised. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so we have a number of steps in the Safer Families process around this particular assessment. The first is, as Katherine said, we do a child and family safety plan within the first 6 weeks of engagement. That's monitored throughout the whole engagement with the family. The family are involved in that, both immediate and wider family and community members are involved in the development of that plan. And the identified concerns are documented, and the people responsible for doing particular things to overcome them are also documented in that plan, and the family has a copy of that. And we, over the course of intervention with the family, continue to monitor and assess whether or not those goals have been met. So both the case plan and the safety plan and the child risk rating tool are used to measure where, at what stage in the reduction of risk the family is at throughout the intervention. We then we have 3 monthly reviews on that at every with all players, so the family's involved in the 3 monthly review where we re-identify what the new situation is and how we're going to continue mitigating risk. And then at the point where it's determined by a clinical assessment of the practitioner that risk is mitigated to a point that we can close, we move to closure. Cultural elements are also assessed for case closure involving Aboriginal children around the strengths and protective factors of culture and connection to community. And we also have seek to identify cultural authority within the family to help us identify how the connection to culture and family has tracked through that process. We also can, in Safer Families, ask for a clinical or cultural consult at the point of closure, just to make sure that we haven't missed anything for that family. So we've got a fair few things in place to be able to identify that.
If there's no family involved for an Aboriginal family, no immediate family identified, do you seek out kinship relationships for?
Our relationships, definitely. We don't do placements.
No.
That's a DCP business.
No.
But we certainly work with Aboriginal kids to find Aboriginal family and connect them with culture and place and home, yes.
Right. And how do you do that? In terms of
Through our Aboriginal consultants mainly.
Right.
So until we've just recently appointed specific Aboriginal consultants, we have had Aboriginal practitioners in each region who have worked on a half-half model, a half caseload and doing half-time cultural consultant for us. So we've utilised those Aboriginal staff to connect with culture, to work out where home is for kids, to talk to family, talk to mob and work out how we can connect Aboriginal kids to culture and family where it isn't there.
So you're doing basically family tracing?
I wouldn't call it family tracing, but we do talk with family and Aboriginal community around getting connections for kids if they aren't present in their life. Yeah.
So what role do they have then with the Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisation in obtaining that information? Like, I'm trying to understand
Yep.
if there is a whole system there in place
Well,
in providing assistance to a
well,
child and a family in need.
certainly an option for an Aboriginal consultant to talk with an Aboriginal community controlled organisation in the region and get that information. Yeah, definitely. Yep, and that happens.
Good.
So of the reports that come through the child abuse report line, Carl, only a very small number of those are acted on by the Department of Child Protection. However, there are a large number of reports which would indicate that a need for family support is evident. Do you consider that DHS have a role in managing the welfare and well-being of vulnerable families where intakes don't meet the threshold as requiring any statutory intervention, and in fact those reports are simply closed on the department's records?
Absolutely. And one of the pathways is through Tier 3.
Right.
So a family doesn't have to have notifications to self-refer into family support services. And as I said before, that new band of family support services has just recently commenced across the state. So for families, regardless of what's happening at that level in terms of notifications and process, any family can ask for help through that and navigate to that through the Ask website and those other mechanisms. Other DHS programs are also part of the picture, again, as I mentioned before, like community centres, children's centres. Safer Family Services has other programs that it runs that are more community level and are not dependent on a statutory pathway, like the parenting programs.
Families Growing Together program that offers parenting support programs to families. And also we have community development coordinators that sit in children's centres that also work with community to try and identify at-risk families who need some support earlier on.
So Tier 3 isn't necessarily like a discrete program.
That's right.
There's a suite of things
Yep.
from a website to community development officers.
Yep.
Um,
There's Safer Family Services programs, Tier 3 programs.
what's that called, sorry?
Safer Family Services operate in Tier 3 through the community development coordinators that are in children's centres and the Families Growing Together and Parenting.
And Parenting SA.
Parenting SA. And the Ask website is probably almost a universal service. I wouldn't even put it in Tier 3 because anybody can access that. But also the recent recommissioning that we did, which saw those 16 new providers come on across the state, called Strong Families, Strong Communities, which includes a number of ACOs. They'll be up on the website and families can self-navigate into them. And to your point, April, they are not a one-size-fits-all. So when we put out the tender, we said, here's what the families are looking like in this system, here's what they need, here are the things that are important to us. And we invited tenders from organisations to say, well, here's what I would do. The intensity is approximately an hour a week or something like that. So we've had quite a range of different providers come on doing quite different things, but all with the purpose of strengthening child safety and family wellbeing within that family support context.
With respect to the early intervention, the need for early intervention and support, a number of the coronial reports that have come out in the last couple of years with respect to Indigenous children in this state have made the point that often when they look at the reports, there have been huge numbers of reports that have just been noted as notify owner concerns and no action taken by the department at all until there's a tragedy occurs. And we've also heard from the public forums too that often families will have repeated reports made and not know that those reports are being made, and then end up in the youth court, and here they've got a stream of historical things that they didn't even realise had been reported. Are you seeing DCP acting on those and referring those through to those notify owner concerns that they're taking no action on through to your services for early intervention?
No, they don't refer knocks through to pathways.
Right.
They refer screened-in notifications,
Right.
generally at the...
That's a distinction, isn't it? Screened in.
Yeah, so generally at the 10-day. So they have two different types, a 24-hour and a 10-day.
Yep.
Generally, the ones that are refer state authority through to pathways are 10-day notifications. We do get a few 24-hour, but not many. But we do get those families that are knocked referred to us through other pathways. So education and birthing hospitals particularly have opportunity when they notify to also refer to us.
Right. But it's not either or, is it?
No.
No.
It has to be a notification to the department.
Well, if it meets threshold for child abuse and they think it requires a notification, then yes, at the moment it does under the Act. But they can also refer to us.
Can they just refer to you?
Oh, yeah, they
Yes.
can.
Oh, okay.
Yep, absolutely. They don't
Without,
have to
without
notify.
making a notification.
Yeah, they can. It's unlikely that something that doesn't meet notification threshold is going to get through and get a service, though, because of service capacity. Right? So it's unlikely that there would be any benefit to that, but they certainly can.
Right.
And then if through our assessment it does meet the threshold, then they would get a service.
It might be worth also adding what we do at Pathways with those that don't get a service, because we don't just close them without telling anybody.
No, we don't. So if you are not going to get a if service through Pathways, we let the referrer know that family's not going to get a service. We provide information to the referrer about possible alternative support services in their area that might be able to support that family in lieu of getting an if service. And we also provide information to the referrer about ways that they may be able to intervene and support the family as well. So we don't just do nothing. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So you've made the comment that you're advocating strongly for the family group conferencing. You'd be able to refer for that. You have no capacity to do so at this stage.
We haven't built a referral pathway between our services and family group conferencing. I mean, no one said no either. We just haven't built it yet, and I think it's an important conversation to have about, you know, how do we design a system where that, like, what is the best utility of that, and at what point would you do which? So, grateful for any findings that the Commissioner may have in regards to that, but obviously the more we can have systems working in an integrated way, talking to each other to support families, the better.
And then at the other end of that as well, like what happens to families after a family group conference?
That's right.
Referrals into IFS or other services. There's not a developed pathway for that either.
Right. Down to number 23. What strategies are you implementing to support at-risk families and their children? There are strategic aims set out in the Safe and Well document, but what are the specific measures being implemented at an agency level within the Department for Human Services?
Probably the best place to look to that is this document, which set those 4 priorities. This is the roadmap.
Sorry, Katherine, just for the transcript, can I get you to actually name what that document is?
Sure. This is the roadmap for reforming the child and family support system, 21 to 23. And this is the document that was produced and released at the time of the commencement of intensive family services. That was the product of the co-design with our sector that I described earlier.
Thank you.
And
I've never seen it before.
oh, really?
Mm.
We had a fairly significant launch at the time, and I brought one for you today, so you can keep this copy.
Honestly, this is the first time I've seen it.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. It is absolutely the foundational document for how we've been working the last 2 years. And so through this, with this healing approach at the centre, and what we heard through the co-design, especially with people with lived experience in terms of the things that were going to be the most effective, this has formed the basis of what we've done. So I'm not sure how helpful it is to talk through all the elements or whether to leave a copy for you, but priority number one was the right support at the right time, which saw the establishment of the Ask website, the Pathways service, streamlined referral pathways, and the child and family support networks that we mentioned before, those multi-agency networks. Priority reform number two was service integrity, which is really all about strengthening the workforce and building their capacity to work better with the child and family support system. That's included the development of practice frameworks, the culturally and trauma responsive workforce training that I mentioned before that's delivered by our ACOs. We've developed a range of products in common elements, which are based on the research about what are the elements that work best for families, including building engagement. And we just recently heard at an evidence and implementation conference a few weeks ago that VAC is doing some really interesting work around common elements for Aboriginal families, and those being embedded into practice in family support services, which is a really exciting initiative that we're going to partner with them on. The trauma responsive system framework, which is another document which I can also leave with you, which talks about how to do a trauma responsive system at every level, including at the organisational level.
Can I just interrupt you there? I'm sorry. These documents are not specifically looking at Aboriginal children, are they? These are across the board. These are all children.
Yes, and have been built absolutely with the foundation of it being culturally responsive and trauma-informed work.
So built on the Aboriginal co-design principles, which put Aboriginal children front and centre of the design of the new system.
Right, thank you.
The third arm is about service investment, which is the recommissioning, and there's also been a range of research initiatives that we've done in that space. And then lastly, building the evidence, and that really speaks to that point I made in my opening statement, which is that's more than just numerical data, although that's important and powerful, but it's also about the voices of people with lived experience and cultural authority, as well as people with practitioner wisdom feeding into what works.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Thank you. Leave that with you.
Thank you. The Department of Human Services encompasses other at-risk communities such as people with disability and the youth justice system. How do you work with vulnerable Aboriginal children and young people in out-of-home care who experience those complexities?
Just to be clear, I don't lead the youth justice system myself. In the department, I can provide some overarching kind of advice about the structure of how that works, but if you would like some further detail, we will need to take those on notice.
Thank you.
Similar to what Kerry said before in terms of safer family services, working with the Department for Child Protection, case conferencing and joint case planning, as well as established processes for information sharing are some of the mechanisms that are fairly well oiled between in particular dual involved young people who might be in contact with the youth justice system and those young people who may also be on guardianship orders. The department and the Department for Child Protection are also working together in relation to the recommendations made recently by the Guardian and Training Centre visitor Shona Reid, who did a particular project on dual involved young people. The clinical approach in youth justice is largely led through a new team called the Enhanced Support Team, who work from a practice of positive behaviour support to help identify ways in which to support young people who are experiencing or demonstrating behaviours of concern, or may also be experiencing other challenges, for example, significant mental health or disability needs. And that team works very intensively to provide wraparound case planning and support for that young person, which is highly individualised.
How many people are in that team?
I don't know that off the top of my head. I will need to find that out for you. There is also a Kalanatapa Senior Aboriginal Cultural Advisor who provides direct cultural support to Aboriginal children and young people in Kalanatapa Youth Justice Centre, and also provides some consultation and advice to community as well as custodial staff on the individual cultural needs of Aboriginal children and young people in the centre. The youth justice system is also adhering to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Youth Justice Principle, which is contained in the legislative framework in the Youth Justice Administration regulations.
For families who have multiple and complex issues, who is working with those families? Is it DHS or is the work delegated to other agencies like Relationships Australia?
Both. So I think that is all the families that are coming into the Child and Family Support System.
Right.
RASA is one of our contracted providers.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And in the research that was conducted by the Early Intervention Research Directorate, ERD, what consultation is being undertaken with the Aboriginal community to address and identify the issues contributing to the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and young people in our child protection system?
ERD don't currently have a piece of commissioned research on that particular question right now.
Mm-hmm.
One of the tasks for next year for the new whatever Roadmap 2.0 looks like is a new research agenda that says what are the questions as a sector that we want to know and that we want to answer. So we haven't designed that yet. We haven't yet had a conversation with our sector and with our providers about what the best research questions are for us next. That would be a good one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And we've heard quite a lot of evidence given to the inquiry that the current system is simply not meeting the needs of families, but particularly disadvantageous to Aboriginal families. It's been submitted that an entire system redesign is required to address the issues of the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in our child protection system in South Australia. Would you agree with that?
Not answering for government, but for me personally, I think that part of the challenge in answering this question when I was looking at it was actually that there's no single system.
No.
You know, we've just had the Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education and Care handing down all of their very well considered recommendations that we need to then put alongside all the recommendations that come from a range of other inquiries and for us, for the Child and Family Support System, we feel like we've actually put a lot of deep thought and co-design into these last few years for this part of the system. Mm-hmm. So I think the challenge for all of us is how do we hold what's good and growing and that's working for people and understand that, and also ask the questions about where it's not working, where are the clunky bits, as well as how do you actually see systems improvement outside of a singular service system, because the child protection system, as it's usually quite narrowly defined, are quite often the same families who are in the housing system and the developmental vulnerability kind of education system and the mental health system and the domestic and family violence system. So as a department, we're probably acutely focused on actually how do we create system cohesion and see ourselves as part of that bigger effort. Poverty is
part of the problem that departments operate in vacuums. That you've got all of these systems that are working with the same families. Is there any cohesion? Is there any communication between them? Does the education department know what you're doing with these families? Does the mental health know what anybody else is doing with them?
I think there's probably no single answer to that question. There are examples where people know exactly what each other are doing because we've set up and established ways of information sharing, like the child and family support networks that are a critical part of people seeing themselves in each other's work, and the diversity of players we have sitting at that table, I think, speaks to that. At other levels, such as at my level, I mean, I regularly meet with my level colleagues in a range of different committees and meetings about things that are areas of shared interest, where it's absolutely our job to not just share that information, but ensure that we're working together.
Right.
But because of the size and complexity, and everybody's very busy, if you were to say, is it working perfectly and everybody knows what everybody's doing? Of course, the answer would be no.
No.
If I can just add, I think in the reform, the CACYP reform that we've done in the last few years, there's been significant practice and performance improvement. But the big thing about this reform that for me is different, and this is probably the fourth major service reform I've done in the last 25 years, the big difference with this one is the way that we have collected the data in a way that over a long period of time we will actually be able to know so much more about the population and the service system that I think it will be able to inform all the bits of the system. All right. So for me, the other thing I would say across those 25 years, reform takes a long time in service systems. And we only went live with this one about 2 years ago, which isn't very long. And so I would just be reluctant to throw it all out for a major system upheaval without giving us a bit more time to see what that data collection across lived experience, practice, wisdom and the numbers can actually tell us in the next year to 18 months.
Yeah. I was going to say more about data, but maybe we'll come back to that at the end.
All right. Well, we're nearly at the end. What role would you say that DHS has in implementing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's placement principles to its fullest extent and intent?
I think we have an involvement throughout, hence us developing this module so that all of our staff and all of our workers can see themselves in the elements.
We are also making that available to all DHS staff, not just our Safe Family staff. We've built it for Safe Families, but we're making it available to all staff across the agency.
So that'll include youth justice and people with disability and other areas, which is terrific.
When you say making it available, does that just mean that they can read it? You're not...
We're talking with organisational development around whether we make it compulsory, how we include it in our online system. So I'm certainly hopeful that it will become compulsory. At the moment it's not. It is compulsory for our staff, but that's the intent, is to work towards that,
Thank you.
Because a considerable element within the principle is prevention,
Absolutely.
which is a key mantra of your organisation.
And I think brings just into such sharp focus that thing I was saying earlier, which is we've got to find better and, easier ways for families to self-navigate into early help and support. We have set up some mechanisms, but that shouldn't and can't be the only thing. It has to happen in all the places, including how we even talk about parenting, and seeking support in a universal sense. So I think there's an extraordinary amount of work to do in there. But we obviously have work and efforts and accountability across most of the areas of the principle, for sure.
Katherine, you're going to speak of something about data.
Well, I was, only because none of your specific questions went to data, but to Kerry's point, the development of the learning system is also one of the most exciting things about the child and family support system in terms of what we're now capturing. When the Early Intervention Research Directorate was first established post-Nyland, the question was, who are the vulnerable families and where are they and what works? And so that work over the last few years that ERD has been doing, obviously in partnership with Safer Families and our NGOs and ACOs, has been to do that epidemiological analysis to understand what the volume might be of those families, which was that 8,500 families, 12,500 children that are at high risk of ongoing and increasing access with the child protection system. so that you then understand who they are, so you can try and get in earlier and support earlier and build pathways earlier. But what we're now implementing, and we've just gone live in the last couple of months with a new referral and outcomes management system that all our providers and Safer Families are now using. So we are now able to capture data that we've never had before in this system, which is, the total number of families who are referred, what the outcome was for them, as in whether or not they were able to get a service. For those who were provided with a service, did they engage? What are the engagement behaviours that the practitioner used? So did they do face-to-face? Did they offer brokerage? So down to that kind of level of response data. And then for those families who were engaged, that family snapshot tool as well, which we use at service commencement and service closure, so we can actually see what changes for families over time. And right back at the beginning, regardless of whether a family gets a service or not, our pathways staff are also doing their own clinical and cultural assessments on a range of things to understand those families. So that after 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, we'll be able to say, who gets a service, who's not getting a service, and what types of programs and service responses work best for whom and where, because we recognise that there are different groups that need different things. So we're going to be in a position to understand that at the system level, not just at the person level, which will be incredibly powerful, including data on what proportion of these families are living in unstable housing, and for them, what works best in terms of what they need to improve their parenting capacity and child safety, versus families who may be experiencing quite significant drug and alcohol problems, and what do they need. And my hypothesis is that those things are very different. So we'll actually start building a more nuanced system about what family support services looks like and for whom, which will be incredible for that broader sector, not just this.
And the importance of the inclusion of practice wisdom in and lived experience in the development of the learning system has been something that, for me, as a social worker of 30 years, I've never seen the interplay before, how quickly we can use the data and the information from lived experience that's coming through ERD to influence the practice of the workforce on the ground. Because we go out with data and information from ERD to our workforce every quarter and say, this is what this quarter's data is telling us, these are the things that are working in engagement, these are the things that aren't working in engagement, these are the types of risks that are most prominent with families. We know that X amount of families have active domestic violence. We know that X amount of families that we see have drug and alcohol parents have drug and alcohol issues. So that real-time interplay between data and practice is something I've never seen happen before in my experience, and it's really influenced the responsiveness of the system.
I appreciate that around practice wisdom and lived experience, but you'd have to acknowledge there is the overlay of what models of service delivery are actually encasing the practice wisdom and the lived experience. But the point I want to make about that is that because I know you referred earlier, Part, that you've developed a senior AHP Aboriginal consultant position, who is the service development
Manager of service development.
Yep. So to what end does that role then work with the Aboriginal community, while we have regard for practice wisdom and lived experience, to develop service models with the emphasis of local level Aboriginal community control, because that's where the impact is?
Yep.
To what end will this role be developing, new services or services that actually work for Aboriginal children and their families?
Well, we're trying with that role to speak with Aboriginal community and families. That role, in partnership with the ACT team, most recently over the last 3 to 4 months, have held 4 forums, 3 with Aboriginal community around CACYP and what we're doing and what we're trying to design around Aboriginal governance, and 1 with the Aboriginal workforce across the state in non-CACYP agencies around CACYP and what we're trying to do. I'm also working with her, the woman in that position at the moment, around trying to create an Aboriginal a local Aboriginal reference group or advisory group to the development of safe family services service models. We involved the co-design in the development of the original service models. So they're some of the ways we're trying to get community voice into the actual design of the service models, which can then influence what we're collecting, which can then influence what we do next time. And I guess that's the nature of the self-learning system. It's cyclical. So what we do influences what we capture influences what we do. And if we continue to do differently, then we'll get different results out of the data, and that will hopefully continue to inform a change in practice. Because I really strongly feel that system design is really important, but the practice within the system is the thing that actually changes people's lives. So you need a well-oiled system that works well together, but you also need practitioners who know how to work in the circumstances they're working in.
But you also have to acknowledge, like, we're at a time when Aboriginal child removals are unprecedented. Like, that is just what we're faced with, particularly in this state as a small jurisdiction. And when you understand what that looked like, those unprecedented levels at the time of the protectionist era, which was just, mid-70s, when we saw things significantly change in terms of the systems and the legislation. And it was Aboriginal people that actually developed the programs and the services at the back end of that era, of those unprecedented levels for that time and that space, that created the change for our children and our families. So what I'm speaking to is understanding that there is a historical and cultural context that has to be understood with reform, and how Aboriginal people and leaders from the Aboriginal community and the Aboriginal community itself is actually involved and actually participating and taking the stewardship of that reform directly for their Aboriginal children. Because the truth is, and this is about truth telling, is that Aboriginal people haven't been involved the way they should be in leading and making those decisions that affect their children. We get best outcomes, because that is what the evidence has shown, when Aboriginal people are making the decisions about systems, about those reforms that have direct effect on their Aboriginal children and young people. So, because it's the dominant culture that drives that, and we haven't seen the changes that we need for our children and young people. So one of the things, I don't know, I think you have another question.
Acknowledge that.
Yes,
I agree.
yeah,
Totally acknowledge
yeah. So, did you have another question?
No, we're at the end of it.
But you've got that last question, I think, but because I do have something that is totally unrelated to that statement I've just made.
No, we've done. That was their last question. Yeah.
Yeah. So DHS is responsible for the screening unit, working with children checks.
We missed that one.
Do you have much understanding about the role of working with children checks
19.
and the relationship to the number of approved carers from our Aboriginal community, and the rates at which our Aboriginal children end up in non-Aboriginal care?
Probably not to the degree that you may need me to answer the question. I have a little bit of information to the particular question that was provided before today, but if you need some more detailed information, then we'll need to take that on notice. The department does have the screening unit, which conducts working with children checks. We don't make decisions about the suitability of kinship carers roles specifically, but we do conduct the working with children checks across the state for a range of different circumstances. Yeah.
Are you aware of the review conducted in Queensland about the similar program, working with children checks,
No, I'm not.
and the direct relationship to the screening unit, the recording of I guess what they produce in their work, and the effect that it has on the system's ability to engage and recruit kinship carers for Aboriginal children?
I'm not aware of it. It's not something that I've read for my role, but it's quite possible that the executive who oversee the screening unit may be aware of it. But
Well, you're not the responsible executive director.
No, I'm not.
My
So
apologies.
that's okay. But if you would like us to answer some further questions as a department, we can
Yes.
provide that.
Thank you.
I hope someone's going to have jotted down all these questions.
I've
Oh,
got the
you've
last
made
three.
notes.
So, is there a specific question of the screening unit you want me to ask, or is it?
Awareness of
No, I think we'll prepare the
Okay.
questions
prepare
for you.
Thank you,
outside
that'd
of
be
this,
great.
Yeah,
Sure.
for the relevant part of the department.
No worries.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I just misread what you had identified. You know, what sits under your responsibility. That's okay.
Don't think I've missed any others. Thank you very much for your
Thank
your
you.
time and your
Thank you.
your information that you've provided today.
Good. Hope it's been useful.
Yes,
Very much so.
Very much so.
Thank you.
I learnt a lot. Good. Yes. As well. Thank you.